How is learning English to be a translator different from learning English to be fluent?
Let's talk about it.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to WaiGuo Friends English. We recently got a very good question from a person on this channel, which is, if you are going through translation, what is the strategy that you need to do, and how is that different from just learning to be fluent in English? Because you don't need to be fluent in English to live comfortably here. If you're okay with having the kind of crutches of getting a translator app to help you translate those hospital forms, then you can live comfortably here in an English-speaking country.
But if you want to communicate deeply, understand the culture at depth, and maybe even lead or train or manage people at work, then having some degree of fluency is actually very, very helpful. But what if you're learning English to communicate between languages, between cultures? So then you will need to learn translation skills. And these translation skills are helpful if you're like an ambassador or a bilingual teacher, or you are some kind of international sales representative, or maybe you just want to be a translator. But regardless, having those translation skills is very helpful, but you also need to have fluency in the target language. There are tons of communication jobs that require this type of skill. So interestingly, learning English to become a translator can be done in a couple of different ways efficiently. Now, there are other ways, of course, there always are. These are the two primary ways that we've seen translators that we know reach the level that they have gotten to. So one is by becoming fluent in English first. Whatever your first language is, becoming fluent in English first by primarily focusing and studying with all your energy on English, then learning translation skills to go back and forth between the languages. The second way is to study English alongside your own language and kind of not necessarily filter it, but continuously translate as you go and as you grow. So at the intermediate levels, you'll be translating intermediate level content. And when you get to advanced levels, it'll be advanced level content, and so on and so forth. But we need to break this down so that we're pretty clear, because the second one especially is easily misunderstood.
Let's start with learning English fluency first and then adding the translation skills. What this means is just going deep. You're looking at the target language and you are really understanding it. You're understanding its culture, you're understanding its history. You're going full sail into that language. Maybe you'll do this for 2 or 3 years where you are just living and breathing that language for an extended period of time. And a big thing is that you will largely be doing this separate of your own language. You're going to be doing this before you start translating. You're not going to be a bridge. You're not that ambassador. You're not going to be that bilingual teacher. You're going to be you in that language. And then only after you become very comfortably and functionally fluent, you will start to then transition to, how do I do this? How do I communicate this to my people back in my own country?
And the benefit of this is that you gain fluency in that language, you really understand it in the way that people think in that culture first. Then you start to work on this literal to figurative translation. How do I take things that don't directly translate? How do I capture the intention and communicate that very clearly in my own language? So it's really, really helpful to go that route.
As opposed to this method, the second method that we're talking about is kind of learning both language in tandem. So both languages and how they interact with each other in tandem. So as you learn more English, then you are constantly comparing that back to your own language. And there are some benefits to this, but also a few pitfalls as well.
To be clear, this is one of the things we see English language learners really screw up. What they end up doing is that they use their first language as a crutch to understand English. That means all the grammar that they learn, so much of the vocabulary, they immediately learn it in conjunction to their own language. They're constantly comparing. They only remember words in English based off of what their meaning is in their own language. And what happens is, you're not actually fluent in English. So when you stop memorizing or you stop practicing and you stop going back to it, you're going to lose it all because it was all based on your first language to start with. So what happens is they effectively make sure that they don't become fluent at all, because they're always going to need their first language to speak English. The other thing that can happen is that it makes them terrible translators, because what happens, they could handle the basic stuff, they could handle even some intermediate stuff. But when it comes to difficult things that require a lot more interpretation and reading between the lines, They're not able to do it because they're putting it through the filter and the worldview from their first language. They're not actually working from an understanding of their English audience and what the English speaker actually is intending to say. It doesn't have to necessarily be that way over years and years and years. Yes, you could come to a more full understanding of what is meant by the culture that you are translating to. There could be lots of conversations with people in your own language of people that know the American mind or the British mind or whatever English-speaking country you're translating for. But that is a lot longer route than going for fluency first and then coming through. So that is a common pitfall, but that is not what we are intending with this method.
The question is it bad though? Is it bad to use your first language as kind of a crutch to help you understand this new language? It really depends on your goal. If you plan on operating in English, purely in English without the use of your own language, like for example, if you're living in an English-speaking country, then you probably don't need to use this kind of method. Otherwise, you're going to be slowed down by constantly trying to translate everything in your brain, because the question is, how do I communicate this to the people around me? If you have people from your own country that are here with you in that English-speaking country, in that target language country, yes, you're going to have to do some translation. But if it's just you, it's going to slow you down a little bit to try to translate everything that comes at you into your native language so that you can make sure that you can translate it back to others. However, one good aspect of this is that if you are planning on being a translator, then that regular practice of translating things as you go actually becomes a skill. Because frankly speaking, a translator is an extremely difficult job, not just because you're translating between two countries, but because the mental capacity that you have to have as a translator to take one language, convert it through you into another language, and then go back the other way is extremely taxing on a person's mind. And so if you're regularly developing that practice of, okay, take this, put it over here, take this, put it over there, then when the time comes for you to translate more difficult things, you will have that skill set already kind of in place.
Now, to be clear, when we're talking about translation skills, we're not just talking about the easy things. Like your family comes and visits in America and you show them around, order them food, get them a hotel to stay. We're not talking about that. We are talking about actually translating taxing things like hospital forms, helping somebody fill those out, working with legal consultations and trying to translate for that, working with more complicated issues like having to solve a debate or an argument that's going on between neighbors. Okay, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. We're talking about things where you're going to be dealing with intention, not straight, easy, literal things to translate back and forth.
So how can we avoid making our first language that crutch when we're learning English or when we're learning a target language?
This is the biggest struggle that we see with people trying to go for translation type work. They want to be able to communicate fluently between their languages, and they end up making a crutch instead of truly making a strong bridge between two fluent languages.
So we have a few ideas. The basic part of this is that you need to study English or whatever your target language is alone, but then have regular translation exercises as you go about it. So for example, you could do something like our Advanced English Vocabulary Study Guide, which helps you to take the words that you're learning and kind of develop that network that we've been talking about a lot on this channel, but then going back over and translating it back into your own language, all the writing exercises and the sentences and things like that.
The idea here is that you will be studying English in English. And now we're not suggesting this at low intermediate level. We're not even suggesting this for intermediate. We're suggesting this if you are already a low advanced speaker, at least a low advanced speaker or an advanced speaker. Everything you be doing for English should be in English. You should be learning new words in English. You should be watching movies in English, hopefully without subtitles. You should be listening to English podcasts. You should be taking in English just with English. You should not be translating or relying on subtitles in your first language or relying on the transcript in your first language to understand the English content. So wrestle with new things in English. Then after that wrestling, go to your first language, and then you can start doing that translation back and forth. It will help you come to a bit of a deeper understanding of that English word. It will also help you make observations with how certain things are different between the languages. Maybe there's a nuance in your language that is not in English, for example.
So you can do this with any sort of media, right? You can do this with a podcast, watch the podcast in English. If you have any problems, look it up then in English. And then once you're done, go back and translate it to make a summary. Summarize what you've seen. If it's a movie series, the same thing. A TV show, same thing. consume it in that language, then translate it. Don't go back and forth and go, part of the movie and then translate, part of the movie, then translate. Try to wrestle with the whole thing as its own individual unit. Right. Then translate that unit into your own language.
The thing is, odds are, if you are on a translation job and you come across something you don't understand, you're going to ask the speakers of that language, let's just say it's English, something in English you don't understand. You're going to be asking the original author or speaker what they meant by that. They hired you because they don't speak in your first language. So for you to figure out what that means or what they mean by that, you would have to ask them, and they're going to explain it to you in English. So you need to work on problem solving your own English misunderstandings in English. That's something that's just par for the course. And it's the same with us with learning other languages. If we want to translate between an English and another language, we would have to learn to solve problems and to gain understanding in that other language. One, you're going to make different observations that way than if you already have a bias from your understanding of that term or that phrase in your own language. If you already feel like you understand that in your first language, then what's going to happen is you're going to be jaded or you're going to be biased with what it should mean in English, when it may not carry that nuance at all.
Another thing you can do is to take a podcast or take a form of media, listen to the whole thing, and then once you're done wrestling with all of that in English, mind you, then at the end of it, write or speak a summary of what you have just seen or heard in English, and then after that, take that summary and then translate it back into your native language.
Or write or record that summary in your own language, not by translating your English summary into your first language, but just do the summary again using your own first language words, and then compare the two and see, why did you choose different terminology here than here? Does it carry the same meaning? Does it mean the same thing? Does it have the same feeling? Does it have the same voice? Things that translators are very concerned with, but maybe somebody just going for fluency may not be that concerned with.
Another thing you can do is to hire a bilingual tutor, somebody that is already kind of ahead of you in the translation game, where they can try to help you out to say, actually, this was a better translation of that, and here's why. It's not just an English tutor. It's not just your own language tutor. Right. It's how well did you translate that, and why did you translate that the way that you did?
Yeah, somebody who will really push you and say, like, defend yourself. Why would you choose that way versus this? Now, this step would be when you're higher up. When you're already comfortably translating back and forth, you feel like you have a good grasp on meaning in both languages and that you feel like you're able to bridge the gap pretty well. Then hire a bilingual tutor to really give you some feedback, some deep feedback, so that you can really refine and finish off your skills in that case, because that would be enormously helpful.
There are a lot of translation practice activities out there. There are so many things to kind of help you get better and faster at translating, because it is a difficult skill. It is its own skill. It's not just a I know English skill. It's a I can take this and I can transfer it quickly, effectively back to my own culture and language. But all that said, here are 4 things that you need to be wary of when you start doing translation practice.
So the first one is, no two languages directly translate to one another with 100% accuracy. You need interpretation skills to understand how literally or figuratively to translate something. And that it is a spectrum, it is a scale. Idioms are the classic example here. Like, idioms do not make literal sense. And if there is an idiom that works great in your language and you have some kind of equivalent, great. What if there's an idiom that doesn't have an equivalent in your language because it's rooted in some historical story in an English-speaking country? This might be a bit more difficult, and you might have to provide more context, or you might have to choose something else, or maybe just don't use an idiom at all. Maybe you'll have to be very straightforward with what you say. So idioms are a big one, but they also might be one of the easier ones to deal with.
Another element of this is that just words have shades of meanings. We've talked a lot about on this channel that words have ranges of meanings. And so when you choose a word to use in your translation, frequently the other word that you're being translated into or from, they have different ranges of meaning. So words are difficult. Even if you do a Google Translate thing and you see, oh, this is the word, the problem is that they carry different connotations and nuances and feelings even within the word itself. And so for you guys, you have to be careful of that when you're trying to choose this word versus that word. You choose 2 different translations to say which one's better. Well, a lot of it comes down to what kind of words are you choosing to carry that meaning.
And this, by the way, guys, is why AI for writing is kind of terrible, because Yes, it can communicate something fluent, but it can't communicate meaning and nuance. It can't communicate feeling very well. It's the reason why native English speakers know when something comes from a company that just use AI to write their emails or their newsletter or a product description, for example. It's pretty easy to tell when it was AI because the word choices are just awkward, they're not appropriate to context, or it used one shade of meaning, but it wasn't the right shade of meaning to really cause the effect that was desired. It's just things like that. So AI just doesn't have the greater context to really work with how to communicate deeply and meaningfully. Now, can it get the job done? Yes. Does it look like AI did the job? Yes.
Another problem that you need to be wary of, and the fact that languages are not the same, is that words have different definitions. So, for example, if you have a word that has 7 different definitions in English, but only one definition in your target language that translates over easily, well, what are you going to do with that word? You either have to be able to take that word and translate it 7 different ways in your language, or you have to do a lot of explaining when it comes down to that word that you're translating over. It's difficult.
Another one to pay attention to are false cognates. There are a lot of words that English has used from other languages, but maybe we change the definition. Or maybe it looks like it comes from your language. Really, we got it from something else. This happens a lot with Latin, French, and Spanish words, and Italian, actually. There's a lot of false cognates. They're words that look or almost sound exactly like the word in those languages, but really we have a different meaning for it because we're actually borrowing from another language that pulled from the same roots as your language. This is really difficult.
The second thing that makes translation difficult and something for you to be wary of is that prepositions are just notoriously difficult to translate between languages.
Some languages, like English, have 100+ prepositions, and then other languages might have 50 or less. And so one is just the sheer amount of defining what in the world that means. What's the difference between in, into, and inside, for example? Those, especially when you throw the adverbs in there. When you throw adverbs in there as well, and you realize that a lot of English prepositions are actually also English adverbs, you get a whole bunch of things. And then you have phrasal verbs on top of that. So there's a lot of difficulty.
Another thing that's difficult with these prepositional words is that your perspective on time and space, it can be very different depending on what culture and language you come from. So for example, in English, time is a horizontal line. You go from last week to this week to next week on this horizontal line.
Or you push a meaning forward or you push it backwards.
But when we were learning Mandarin, we found it very funny because time moves from up to down.
So last week was up week and next week is down week.
And so just the perspective on it, that may not sound like a big deal to some of you, but it makes a big difference when you're choosing what words you want to say. Sometimes you can get kind of lost when you're even translating something simple as next week and you say down week.
Another one is in Hebrew. They would go from right to left in their language. So time, if you give them a stack of pictures and ask them to sort them chronologically, they're more likely to go from right to left, where English speakers would go left to right, and Chinese would probably go left to right, but they also could go top to bottom. So it's interesting that prepositions are all changed by this, and that's just time. That doesn't include space. Space is even more difficult with prepositions between languages.
And another reason why prepositions are horrible and terrible is that they often can refer to very tangible things. The ball is on the box. The ball is under the box. The ball is inside the box. But it can also be difficult because they can refer to intangible things. You could say something like, my feelings inside me just exploded out all of a sudden because of the emotion of the moment. So they can be tangible boxes or they can be intangible like feelings.
Verb tenses is a third one to watch out for. And some of you guys who've been learning English already know this, but verb tenses can communicate completeness or their impact on today, their past completeness that impacts today. It can also communicate whether something is in reality or not, or possible or not. It could also be, whether something's continuing or not, or will be continuing at a certain point. Verb tenses can be confusing, okay? Some languages have very simple verb tenses, but then some languages have very complex verb tenses. And so there are languages much more complicated in verb tenses than English. Likewise, there are some that are far more simple. So, for example, languages with simple verb tenses make this up by using adverbs and adjective phrases. That's typically what they do. They're not able to not communicate. It's just They don't have to communicate that much information because they can fill it up if they choose to with something else. But in English, we carry so much information in our verbs. If we're speaking informally, we don't even have to use adverbs if we don't need to because the verb has plenty of meaning in it. The other thing is like the way that verbs conjugate is just different. So for example, we might change our spelling. We might use an irregular verb. We might add something to the end of it. Some languages actually have a certain set of suffixes that will change things. And you can tell the verb mood and its verb tense and verb aspect just off of those endings. But that's not necessarily the case with English. You can't really tell that. We have to use auxiliary verbs to help with that. For example, in Ukrainian, there are 3 tenses, past, present, future, and there are 2 aspects, perfective and imperfective. The imperfective aspect can apply to the past, present, or future because it explains something that is still happening, or it describes ongoing or habitual actions. But the perfective can only happen in the past or the future because by definition, the present is now and it cannot be complete now. And it would describe more complete actions, which is interesting because it means you can describe something as complete in the future, but we can do the same thing in English. So shouldn't be that surprising. So the now in Ukrainian grammar logic is a little bit different than the now in English grammar logic because already now in English, we can make that a complete action. We can make it an ongoing action. We can make it a habitual action. We can just make it a simple fact. We can make it something from the past that impacts now continually. So in English, we have these 3 verb tenses, past, present, future, but then we also have those 4 aspects, okay? So we have, generally speaking, your courses will teach you there are 12 tenses. Aspect would be like the progressive and the perfect progressive, right? And the simple. But a lot of courses will just call them tenses to make it easy. Now, Italian has 21 tenses, okay? There's a lot more. They have that perfective and imperfective as well. They have a 4th tense that we don't have in English. They also have more aspects. In addition to all of this, for all 3 languages, we need to add mood, which is going to change things even more. Verb tenses are complicated, and being able to translate between them, realizing that English just doesn't have everything that Italian has. It just doesn't, because they will tie formality in there with their verb tenses, and there's a lot of politeness or distance between speakers or whatnot. It's complicated. So being able to translate between those languages is going to have to take this into consideration.
The last thing that you need to be wary of that we're going to talk about today is word order and sentence structures, because as a lot of you very well know, sentences are not structured the same across languages. Here in English, it's a subject-verb-object order, but people oversimplify this problem because even English doesn't have to be a subject-verb-object order kind of language. Yes, generally speaking, that is what needs to happen. We can flip some things around and get a passive sentence, but even more than that, sometimes people use very creative ways to say something or just mistakes when saying something, and you have to be able to know how to translate that back in your own language. Use an example of Mandarin here. Mandarin is, generally speaking, grammatically a surprisingly flexible language. Yes, there is a certain order that it has to be done. One of the worst questions you could be asked in a Mandarin comprehension exam is which of these sentences are most correct, because all of them can be spoken, much the same as to English. The question is which of them sound the best? And that's the thing that you have to be careful of when you're translating between these 2 languages, because the person may have said a wrong subject-verb-object order or whatever, but you are supposed to translate it properly into your language with a potentially different sentence structure or subject-verb-object order.
Sometimes, and in some languages, the order of a sentence or a phrase is dictated by what a person wants to emphasize, or what's most important for you to understand, or how angry they are. What are they feeling? Sometimes it's formality. So in some places, you're going to use very complete, proper language. Other places, you're going to chop your sentences up. You may not even have a subject or a verb in it. You're just going to have like some kind of minor sentence. So again, learning to translate this and interpreting formality as you go is really important. Fluency really helps. This is why we really suggest fluency if you're going to be any kind of translator, especially professionally, because if you can understand not just by memorizing the language gets you somewhere, but it doesn't get you anywhere where you can really interpret and really understand where somebody's coming from. There's also this degree of the way that people speak is intentional. We choose the way that we speak. We choose the formality we use. We choose the grammar we use on purpose. Now, sometimes people make speaking mistakes, and that's fine. You don't have to translate those mistakes unless those mistakes are done purposefully. then you would have to translate those a little bit to some degree in order to capture the idea that's in there. Think of it like trying to translate a comedic sketch. It wouldn't make sense if you just made everything just super clean and proper in your language, or you fixed their mistakes purposely in your language, and everybody's laughing over here, but people listening to your first language translation of it might not get whatever the joke is, right? If the joke is in the way the person is speaking, you're going to have to be able to capture that somehow.
Guys, so much of translation is actually a two-way street. It's not just I consume a media, I translate that media to another person. You probably full well know how many times a person says something in the target language, they say it to a translator. That translator has to, before they translate this sentence to their native language, they have to come back and they have to ask this person, hey, just to clarify, what did you mean by this? Because I need to be able to translate that correctly back to my native language. There's this two-way street that is involved with translation, and that's what we're talking about. That's why it's difficult. That's why translation is difficult. So you guys, since you're studying English, you have to make that decision. Are you going to constantly be going back and forth from language to language so that you can kind of build the skill of translation while also building English? Or are you going to kind of zero in and focus on English itself and then add those translation skills after you've gotten to some degree of fluency?
Mind you, we are talking to individuals who are working busy adults who are learning a language so that they can work on their careers, so they can add an asset to their resume, whatever it is. But when you're an adult, your time is so limited. So the way that you study needs to be very efficient, and it needs to have your goal in mind constantly. For kids, they just pick this up running around, but they've got all the time in the world. They're forced to go to school where they have to learn it. They've got tons of people like pushing them and keeping them accountable to that language. But as an adult, nobody's going to blame you for just slacking on your homework for a day so that you can get some sleep that you didn't get the night before, right? Then that can happen again and again and again. So mind you, the way that we're talking about this is in relation to working adults who are trying to learn English or gain translation skills in order to heighten their career or to add something to their resume. We are not talking to people that have all the time in the world, or a university student learning a translation degree in school. We're not talking to them because it's different. They have more time. This is their job to learn this. But as an adult, if you're working a different job, you're trying to do this to improve, it's different. You just don't have the time that everybody else has. So that's where these suggestions are coming from. They are not coming from oh yeah, it's impossible to do it any other way. That is not what we're saying. We're speaking from our experience as English teachers working with individuals going for this goal.
All right, guys, that was a lot, and it's because translation is a lot. And we hope that as you were able to listen to this video, you were able to gain some wisdom that we have earned from our decades of experience at this point in the game. We hope that it helps, and we will catch you on the next one.